Okay, so the Saagar Enjeti and Crystal Ball Show, The Rising, recently posted a video titled Biden Abandons Working Class. Being fairly familiar with Biden's proposed policies, I was curious to see what they were referring to. It turns out that their source material for this claim is a single tweet that clarifies that it's households earning $400,000 or more, not those making $250,000 or more, who will see an increase in taxes. That's right, never mind the policies clearly laid out on the Biden website. Never mind Biden's plan for corporate and capital gains tax rates. Never mind Biden's plan to close certain tax loopholes. Saagar's entire argument amounts to a couple of minutes of virtue signaling, that Biden's plan to raise taxes on the top 1% instead of the top 6% amounts to abandoning the middle class. Aside from completely ignoring actual policy specifics, he's also wrong about how this proposed tax rate increase compares to Hillary Clinton's proposed increase back in 2016. I've noticed something else. Saagar always claims to have quote-unquote looked at the data. But he never seems to share said data. So, let's unpack everything that's wrong with this take, and dive into what they're leaving out. I want to make it clear that Joe Biden wasn't my first nor my second pick. Really, he was probably one of my least favorite of the Democratic candidates. Nevertheless, false narratives like these provide cover for Republicans by minimizing the difference between them and even mainstream Democrats. If these vanilla Democrats are anywhere near as bad as their GOP counterparts, there should be no reason to create these false narratives. It should be more than enough to simply state the facts as they are. Yet, this isn't what I see from people like Saagar. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe and click the notification button.
But one thing that's been driving me absolutely crazy about all of the polls-driven debate and more is how much it leaves out the many millions of Americans who don't vote in the first place, and how both parties appear locked in a brutal war to win back moderate suburban voters, while workers who lived one blown tire away from bankruptcy before the economic depression are left to rot.
Left to rot. Saagar is about to ignore the easily accessible policies on the Joe Biden website, and pretend that the entirety of Biden's economic agenda is contained in a single tweet clarifying where the top marginal tax rates on incomes will be set. This tweet doesn't even say anything about corporate or capital gains tax rates. But note Saagar's false premise that Biden's ability to help middle and lower income workers depends on whether he sets the top income tax rate at $250,000 as opposed to $400,000.
Joe Biden's campaign made this push crystal clear yesterday, not just in his speech denouncing riots, which we talked a lot about earlier in the show, but in a much less noticed clarification on his tax plans that it was provided to the Washington Post. Now, Biden's campaign responded to the Washington Post's so-called fact-checker that they would, under no circumstances, allow taxes to be raised on Americans making less than $400,000 a year, including payroll taxes, tax deferrals, retirement accounts, and more. That might sound reasonable, except, as I've reminded so many of you of recent months, Joe Biden, with his declaration, is less progressive on tax policy than Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama. In fact,
to be clear, Obama actually raised the top marginal tax rates on households making $450,000 and above. He may have campaigned on setting those rates on households making $250,000 and above, but that's not what was actually passed, so keep that in mind. And as far as Hillary Clinton, she was also going to start those 39% top marginal tax rates at incomes above $400,000. You can compare their tax plans on the Tax Policy Center website and see that Biden's tax plan stands to raise 2.5 times the revenue off of the top earners than Clinton's did. So Saagar either didn't do his homework or he's telling, let's just call it, an untruth. And for the record, a family of 4 making $250,000 in a place like New York City or San Francisco certainly doesn't feel wealthy. Sure, they may not be feeling the economic pain that so many Americans are feeling, but virtue signaling over where this is set is kind of silly when you consider that incomes aren't even where the real wealth is being made. More important is what Joe Biden plans to do with the corporate and capital gains tax rates.
I dug into the data. I discovered that Biden didn't just arrive on $400,000 out of nowhere. It happens to be the approximate number of the top 1% of American households, where the number of households making more than $250,000 is something like 6 or 7% of Americans. So what does that tell you? Biden is making the absolute pledge to hundreds of thousands of the wealthiest households in America that he will not raise their taxes, when previous Democratic nominees like Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton say that they would have. That is the realignment happening in Joe Biden's Democratic Party. To the cosmopolitan elites who make between $250,000 and $400,000, Joe Biden has the same message that he has for Wall Street. Nothing will fundamentally change.
If a family of 4 in a household with at least 2 incomes is considered elite, then I think the word elite has lost any real meaning. I understand if one feels that $400,000 is too high and it should be set lower. I happen to think it's just the right threshold, but reasonable people can disagree as to where this should be set. But Saagar's focus on this is puzzling, given everything that he's ignoring.
Crystal and I have asked many times, why wouldn't Biden, in the middle of this moment, out of a matter of political necessity, try to have some ambitious economic plan to garner working class votes who have been destroyed by this economic depression?
Joe Biden actually has some surprisingly ambitious plans. Far more ambitious than I expected. This includes a clean energy jobs plan intended to create 10 million jobs. And, well, screw it, let's just play this excerpt from Destiny. But I will link to these policy proposals in the description.
Especially combined with your later statement of being in favor of the Nordic model system. Like, I don't understand how we can ever think that Trump is more closely aligned with that than Biden is. Like, Biden wants to quadruple federal spending on low-income housing. Like, he wants to triple spending on low-income K-12 schooling. He wants to double Pell Grants, right, making education more affordable to people. He's talking about like a massive expansion of the ACA, giving a public option available to all Americans, which more closely resembles like a universal health system in any Nordic country compared to what we have in the U.S. right now. Trump, like, the Republicans literally just defunded the ACA and said, good luck. We've got nothing, like nothing to replace that dismantling of the ACA. Biden's talking about $100 billion investment in affordable housing. You know, when we talk about houses being affordable to people, you know, like Sweden guarantees that everybody can sign up on a list for a house when they turn 18 or whatever. That list is fucking long. $10 billion set aside in Biden's administration for transit projects in high poverty areas. Like, nothing here is under Biden's system. Is under Trump's system. You know, Trump for education has talked about like school vouchers, which historically have like never served the interests of poorer people. Charter schools in the U.S. I like barely even beat public schools, I think, in terms of outcome. Biden's administration and his suggestions are some of the most progressive we've ever had. Like, especially when you talk about environmental stuff earlier. Like, Biden has got like one of the most aggressive environmental plans that we've ever seen of like any White House administration ever, any incoming president ever, assuming that he wins. Bernie himself, his cabinet has worked, or his team of people have worked with Biden to come out with these plans that are supposed to be way better for the environment than anything we would ever see out of a Trump team. This idea of like the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, like you just described all of Trump's tax cuts, like disproportionately more money going to wealthier people, the poor not really getting as much. You know, look at how much of a struggle, how much of a fight it's been just to get checks sent out to people that Trump is just having his name written on.
But you aren't going to get this from Saagar's virtue signaling over a single tweet. So, let's turn to David Pakman, who will explain Biden's tax plan by using Biden's actual tax policy as his source.
What I'm looking here is not to sow division, but rather to point out that Joe Biden's tax plan is really quite solid and would do a lot to tax the people that most should be taxed from the progressive perspective. A lot of times the debate over taxes over the last 20 years has been, should the richest pay 39 or 36%, 39.6 or 37%? Like, that's the debate that is 80% of the debate. When we talk about rolling back the Bush tax cuts or rolling back the Trump, what we're mostly talking about for a lot of people, right? I think it's about 500,000 and up in income, is should the richest pay 36 or 39%? This ignores capital gains. This ignores that we need higher and bigger tax brackets, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Let's look now at some of the things that Joe Biden has in his tax plan. Now, I want to remind you, Dwight D. Eisenhower had these high top marginal tax rates of like 90%, but he had them at a time where there were a ton of mechanisms to avoid actually paying a high effective tax rate if you were very wealthy. So when you look back at what matters is the effective tax rate. If you look back at the Eisenhower era, even though you had those high marginal tax rates, the top 1% of taxpayers in the 50s were only paying about 42% total of their income in taxes. So as a result, the tax burden on high income households today is only slightly lower than what those same top 1% paid in the 1950s. And what Joe Biden is proposing to do could raise taxes on the rich well beyond what they were under the Eisenhower 91% top marginal tax rate days. Because as you can see, since the early 90s, the effective tax rate on the top 1% has bounced between 35 and 40%. Okay, so what will Joe Biden's tax plan do? Number one, yes, it will undo those Trump brackets that are similar to the George W. Bush brackets. The top tax rate will go from 37% to 39.6%. It's the right move. It's not that big of a thing for a large swath of Americans. The very important change that Biden would make is that earnings above $400,000 would be subject to the Social Security tax of 12.1%. This is monstrous in terms of the total amount of money. Right now, you stop paying Social Security tax at about $137,000 in income. You pay it on your first 137K, then it goes to zero. What Biden proposes is there's a donut hole there between 137 and 400,000 where you don't pay that 12% tax. But then when you get to $400,000 in income and going all the way up, you pay 12.1%. That is absolutely massive in terms of the amount of money that would collect. And that money would be used to increase the Social Security benefits for the poor. So that would actually remove hundreds of thousands of seniors from poverty. It costs the middle class zero, and it comes from people earning over 400,000. Now, you might correctly say, but David, hold on a second, sir, as Donald Trump says, David, a lot of the rich are the non-working rich. They're not earning wages, so they wouldn't be affected by that. And you're completely correct. The other thing that Joe Biden's tax plan would do is remove the lower capital gains rate on dividends and the long-term capital gains rate if you make over $1 million per year. So the non-working millionaires would be paying in dramatically more money because they would have to pay their income tax rate rather than the capital gains rate on a whole bunch of dividends and capital gains. This could double the tax rate for non-working millionaires who get most of their income from investments. Also, very importantly, Biden is calling for a full repeal of stepped up basis. Now, this requires a little bit of explanation, but what this means is if someone donates, imagine that someone buys $1,000 worth of stock in the 1970s, they die, and they give you $1 million worth of stock. That's a huge gain, right? It went from 1,000 to $1 million. This is a cartoonish example. What the stepped up basis allows is that if you as the heir with that stock decide to sell it at a time when it's worth $1.1 million, stepped up basis allows you to only pay gains on the gain from the time you inherited the stock to the time that you sell it. So even though the person who gave you the stock went from $1,000 to $1 million in value, when you got it, it was worth $1 million and it went up to 1.1. You only pay capital gains on that $100,000 from $1 million to 1.1. That is a massive, massive handout on which taxes could be levied, and it is not. And it is estimated to be, if Joe Biden were to eliminate the stepped up basis provision, that would be more than $4 trillion of a tax increase on the rich. So Joe Biden's tax plan actually does a lot of good. Now, let's be thorough. It doesn't do a lot of things that we should be looking at, that other candidates have proposed. Joe Biden has not proposed a financial transaction tax, a little slice which could be used to fund all sorts of important programs. Joe Biden doesn't do that. Joe Biden has found, or Joe Biden's plan does not include higher tax brackets with higher interest rates. So right now, if you would cap out around $600,000 with Biden's tax plan, it'd be 39.6% you pay beyond $600,000 in earnings. We probably should have a tax bracket at 40% between 600,000 and $1 million in earnings. We should have a 45% tax bracket between 1 and 3 million, et cetera. Joe Biden doesn't do that. I think that we need that. And then number three, To the dismay of some people, Joe Biden's plan doesn't include a wealth tax. Now, I actually don't think a wealth tax would ever pass. So while it's an interesting idea, I'm not going crazy because Joe Biden doesn't include it. But if we look at the reality, if we look at the analysis that the Tax Policy Center has done of this plan, 3/4 of the increases fall on the richest 1%, and a whole bunch of that other 25% is on the top 5%. This is a very progressive tax plan compared to what we've seen, certainly for the last 50, even 100 years in the United States. I'm not saying Joe Biden is the greatest, period, but let's be honest and look at the tax plan for what it is.